we will carry on with the IS-LM model, which we started already last lecture. Just to see the big picture, what we did last week when we talked about the IS and LM model. So we basically had two curves. One is the IS and the other is the LM curve, and both represent equilibrium in the goods market, and when you put both together, they represent equilibrium in the goods market and in the financial markets. So what we have in this diagram or this graph, we had Y, we measure output level in the horizontal axis, I, or the interest rate, on the vertical axis. And that basically what we have from this is the pair of I and Y, interest rate and output level, that clears both markets at the same time. Both markets here refer to the goods market and financial markets. So we know that any point on the IS curve represent an equilibrium point in the goods market, and the curve itself is downward sloping curve. Remember, we have Y, or output level, in the horizontal axis, and I, or the interest rate, on the vertical axis. So the LM curve, every point on the LM curve represent an equilibrium point on in the financial markets or in the money markets, and the curve itself is upward sloping. Again, remember, we have I on the vertical axis and Y on the horizontal axis. And what we said last time, we said why we will treat LM as horizontal line, because what modern central banks do, they choose interest rate and they adjust money supply to achieve that interest rate. But traditionally what we used to do, we used to have an upward sloping LM curve. So when we think about changes or how we use this, which we will focus on today, when we use this IS-LM model for policy analysis, you need to keep in mind that the idea of or the condition of ceteris paribus, which means other things being equal or the same. So when we assume a change in any policy variable like government spending, we, in the same time, we think that, okay, nothing else has changed. It's only one variable. And then we trace the effect of that variable on the equilibrium. So we see how the equilibrium change, or meaning we see what would happen to the interest rate and the output level accordingly after that change, as a result of that change. So if we have an expansionary fiscal policy, for example, that means a rise in the net government spending, which means the difference between government spending and taxes, G minus T, and that would shift the IS curve to the right. And if we have a contractionary fiscal policy, it will do the opposite. So a contractionary fiscal policy, meaning we have a fall in net government spending, G minus T, goes down, and that would shift the IS curve to the left. So see, what we thought about here is the change, or how the IS, or how goods market conditions will respond to this change in fiscal policy. We assume that, okay, the effect happen entirely through the effect in the goods market. So if we have a expansionary monetary policy, that means a rise in real money supply, and that will shift the LM curve to the right. The other case, if we have a contractionary monetary policy, that means a fall in real money supply, and that would bring or would shift the LM curve to the left. Obviously, I'm talking here about upward sloping curve, but if we have horizontal line or curve, LM, so if you follow an expansionary monetary policy, that means the interest rate should fall, and that means the LM curve should shift downward. Okay? If you have contractionary monetary policy or increasing interest rates, so if the central bank decided to increase the interest rate, so that means in such case, if we have a horizontal LM curve, that means it should shift upward. So so that was the big picture. That's what we concluded with last lecture. Okay, so basically what we did, we drive the IS curve. We explain how to get to this point, how to drive a downward sloping curve, which represent the IS curve or the equilibrium in the goods market, and we did the same for the LM curve or the equilibrium in the money market, and then we show the equilibrium in both markets at the same time, which means the point that these two curves intersect or meet each other. So just as a reminder, when we drive the IS curve, I had interesting conversation with some of you from after the lecture last week and also before the lecture today. So the bottom line here is, remember, keep in mind what we have in both axes. We have Y, the output level in the horizontal axis, and I on the vertical axis. So what we are interested in here, if we talk about the goods markets, if we talk about the IS side, then we talk about how interest rate affect, how changes in the interest rate would affect aggregate demand. Okay? And in lecture 3, we assume that investment is given, it's exogenous, but this is not true. Okay? So this is not realistic. So what we did in the last lecture, we said, well, in a more realistic situation, investment should respond to changes in the interest rate and changes in income. Okay? So we know that investment is negatively correlated to changes in the interest rate. So a higher interest rate, that means lower investment, or investment will fall, or a lower investment rate, interest rate, that will increase. So they're moving investment, so they're moving in opposite direction, and that's the key. So how would that affect aggregate demand? We know that aggregate demand, remember the components of the aggregate demand: consumption, investment. So investment is there. So once investment respond to a change to the interest rate, then we would imagine or would expect the aggregate demand curve to shift either upward or downward, depending how investment respond to the change in interest rate. So if we have if the interest rate fall, that means higher investment. That means aggregate demand should shift upward, should go up. If we have higher interest rates, that means investment should drop, and that means aggregate demand will drop as well. And that's exactly what we explained. Once you have the IS curve, that means again every point on that curve is corresponding to an equilibrium point in the goods market. And when we talk about equilibrium in the goods market, we mean production equal income, or investment equal saving, because that's where the IS come from. So investment equal saving, IS, investment and saving. So this is how we did it last time. So let me so that's exactly, I just plot both the aggregate demand. So we have aggregate demand in the top graph, and then this is the initial equilibrium when, let's say, a given level of I, and then we just need to assume now that there is a change in interest rate. Let's say it falls. So if interest rate go down, that means investment increase, that means the aggregate demand should go up, and that will take us to another equilibrium point. If you connect these 2 points, that's exactly what we did. I know it's going fast, so I'm going to do it just again, so slower this time. So in the top part of this graph, so we have the aggregate demand. Remember, this is the 45 degrees line, and this is the initial level of aggregate demand. And at this level, let's say at a given interest rate, and that interest rate, I called it I1. And all what I wanted to do in the bottom part of this, and the lower part or lower section of this graph, I just want to put the I and Y space, so the interest rate and the output level. All what I did here is just I highlighted the I1, which is the given level of interest rate at the first equilibrium point in the goods market, and I'm connecting these points, or identifying this point in on the IY space. So this is the first point. So how you go from here is that how investment respond to change in interest rate. So if I have a change in interest rate, let's say interest rate drop to I2, where I2 now is smaller or less than I1. So the way that the aggregate demand respond to that is, again, because we know there's negative relationship between investment and interest rate. So lower interest rate means higher investment, and because investment is a component in the aggregate demand, that means a shift in the aggregate demand, upward shift in the aggregate demand curve, which is in the red line, this red line now. So that take us to another equilibrium point, which is the intersection with the 45 degrees line. All what I need to do now is to identify these 2 points. We know that I2 is higher than, is lower than I1, and now we know where is the the equilibrium point for Y, so which is Y2. Connecting these 2 points, that basically give you the IS curve. Okay, that's what we did last time. On the other side, before we move to the LM, we talked about the slope and the position. So it's very important to understand what would shift the IS curve to the right or to the left. So again, any factor that shift the aggregate demand upward will shift the IS to the right. Any factor that shift the aggregate demand downward would shift the IS curve to the left. The slope or the steepness of the IS curve depend on how sensitive investment to the interest rate. If a small change in interest rate results in a massive change in investment, so that means investment is very sensitive to changes in the interest rate, that means you will have a flat, nearly flat IS curve. Okay, but if investment is insensitive, so it doesn't respond by much to changes in the interest rate, so say we have a massive or big change in the interest rate, but investment change very slightly, so that means you would imagine or you'd expect the IS curve to become more steeper. Okay. On the other side, the LM curve, again, this equilibrium in the money market, and LM comes from liquidity preference, so liquidity L equal M or money supply. So this is the equilibrium condition in the money market, and then again, LM give us again I, it's on the I and Y space or interest rate and output level. So the way we drive the the LM curve is basically you have initial equilibrium point in the money market, which again is the point where the demand for money curve, which is downward slope curve, intersect with a vertical line, which is the money supply, which we assume that's given by the central bank. So it's exogenous to this model. And when there's a change in income, let's say income has increased, that means a higher demand for money because of transaction purposes, and that means the demand for money curve will shift upward. That's exactly what you will see now. And from there, that will give us the equilibrium point in, so this is the initial equilibrium in the money market, and here I'm going to plot the LM. So I'm putting this side by side because I want to see the corresponding or the same level of the interest rate. So this is the money supply. So we said it's given. It's kind of exogenous because it's determined by the central bank. Let's say it's called M bar here. Bar here means just an exogenous or a fixed amount of money supply. And this is the demand for money. So from last time we explained that if this now as given at a given level of income, I'm just going to identify that I now, so this is the interest rate, the equilibrium interest rate at this point in both graphs now. What I want to do now is to see what would happen if there is so let's call this I1. What I want to know now, this is the given level of Y or income. So now if we assume that income has changed, let's say now there's an increase in income, let's say Y2 is greater than Y1, how would this change the money supply or the situation in the money market? Basically, that will increase demand for money, which means we'll shift the demand for money, the money demand curve upward, because again, if you remember, we demand money for three reasons: transaction, precautionary, speculative purposes. So that means if income has increased, that means you demand more money for transaction. So that means MD curve will shift upward. So the red one now just denote the change or the shift in the demand for money, which correspond the a higher level of income, Y2. So that means the interest rate has increased from I1 to I2. So it's a higher level of an interest rate. So basically, we already know that Y2, which is associated with this level, is higher than Y1. So I'm just going to put it somewhere higher than Y1. If you plot these 2 points, connect these 2 points together, that give you the LM curve. So as you see, it's upward sloping curve. But again, the reason last time we plot that as a horizontal line is again because we know that modern central banks, they choose interest rate and then they adjust money supply accordingly to achieve that interest rate level. So again, we ask the same questions about the slope, about how steep the LM curve should be, and we said that it depends on income elasticity and interest elasticity of money demand, or how much demand or how much demand for money will respond to change in income or change in the interest rate. So larger income elasticity, that means a steeper LM curve, so be more steeper. Or if LM is not sensitive to changes in the interest rate, that means LM curve should be kind of very close to vertical. But if it is very sensitive, which is just think of the case now where as we said, central banks choose the interest rate, so kind of at any given level, at any level of income, so it's going to be the same interest rate that has been chosen by the central bank, and obviously the central bank will change money supply to achieve that. So as a result of that, so we treated the LM curve as a horizontal line, so we took I as given in this case from the central banks. And that's why we plot LM curve horizontal in this case, and we explain, okay, this point, the intersection point between both LM and IS, this point denotes equilibrium simultaneously in both markets, the goods markets, which is represented by the IS line or curve, and the LM curve, which represent the money markets or financial markets. Okay, so basically we're just going to carry on. We're going to build on that and do some sort of talk about short-run or demand-side policy analysis. We will see the story. Last time we made some changes. We said, oh, okay, if there's a fiscal policy shift in where government spending has increased, how this is going to affect the equilibrium in both markets. Again, we're looking at this pair, I and Y. So what would happen to the interest rate and what would happen to the output level as a result of that change. And then we will talk about a special case which we call the liquidity trap. So we will do some scenarios and see how that story works exactly. So the first scenario, when we have a fiscal policy shift. So just to keep you focused on the point, so what we want to know is what's going to happen to I and Y. What's going to happen to the interest rate and output level as a result of the shift in the fiscal policy? So fiscal policy shift happened due to changes in government spending or taxes or both. And then the consequences here, or what we're looking for here, is what would happen to, or how the interest rate and the output level will respond to that change. Again, just to remind you, when we talk about a change in or a policy shift, we just assume that the ceteris paribus condition apply, which means that we will consider the movement in the IS curve that's caused by the fiscal policy. We're not worried much about how LM curve change or would shift, because we know that LM curve would shift because of the change in monetary policy. So the bottom line here, that fiscal policy will change the market condition, the goods market condition, not the money market condition. So the impact of fiscal policy basically goes to the was reflected in how the IS curve will move. So, but we said that very quickly last time and very briefly, but we didn't really explain the idea here. How I and Y, or how the interest rate and output level will respond to a change in fiscal policy. Obviously, there are changes that will happen in both markets, the goods market and the money market. And this is one of the points that one of you actually discussed with me last time after the lecture. So let's now assume that there is a rise in net government spending, G minus T. Okay, so this is an expansionary fiscal policy. Okay, so now the government now decided to increase how much they spend in the economy, and what we learned from before, that means more spending means income. So that means higher income. So that it means income will increase. And when income increases, you know the story from before. Income increases means consumption increase, depending on the what? The propensity to consume. So when income increases, then remember the story of the multiplier and the story of C1, which we call the propensity to consume. So the very simple example I gave before, I said, okay, if income increases by £100 and marginal propensity to consume was 80%, so that means people will spend £80 or £80 million, depending on how much the initial increase was. Okay, so the idea here, this sort of rounds, so moving from one point, okay, just to give you the bottom line, to tell you what is the bottom line here, to move from one equilibrium point to another equilibrium point, it doesn't happen like a jump, okay? It doesn't happen in one move. It's a process. Okay, so go through circles or rounds of changes. Okay, and that's until we end up to reach another equilibrium point. So what you need to understand here at this point. So moving from point A, equilibrium point A, to equilibrium point B doesn't happen in one jump. Like, you need to think about, there's a process, there's like underlying process that happens behind the scene here. So in our scenario here, we assumed, okay, there's an increase or an expansionary fiscal policy and an increase in government spending. What we're trying to trace out here is that what was going to happen in the goods market and what's going to happen in the money market. So in the goods market is very straightforward. Having a higher government spending means a higher income, and higher income means higher consumption, and a higher consumption means again another round of higher income, and that will keep going on that way, okay, until the effect dies out at the end. Okay, so and at that point, then again we go back to another equilibrium point again, where production equal income, etc. So we already said that story before. Okay, in the money market, then the rise in income. How would money market respond to a change in income? Remember, that means a higher level of demand for money. So now people will demand more money. Now, given that income has increased, that means more demand for money for transaction. Okay, so remember why we demand money for 3 reasons. One of them is for transaction, and that depends on income, and it's positively related to income. So higher income means higher demand for money. Okay, and if money supply was fixed, that the adjustment should happen through change in the interest rate in the money market. But if, this is very important. So if the central bank chooses the interest rate and then adjust money supply to achieve that, then the adjustment will mainly happen, wouldn't happen to the interest rate, because the interest rate is given or fixed at this point, and the adjustment will happen through the change in money supply. Okay, so in our case, which we assume that this is actually the case, the adjustment here doesn't happen through interest rate, it happens to the money supply. And in other words, the central bank chooses that interest rate and is not willing to change that interest rate as a kind of response to the adjustment that happened in the money market as a result of the change in fiscal policy. But in that case, they have to change something else. The adjustment has to happen through changing money supply. And that's what we agreed on from lecture 4, I think. So what we said modern central banks, they choose interest rate and then they let money supply adjust to, or they adjust money supply to achieve that interest rate. Okay, so what happened here is, or what you see in the graph is just an example of contractionary fiscal policy where taxes have increased. Okay, so this is the opposite effect. So what I explained in the previous lecture, I started with an expansionary fiscal policy, but you'll see between brackets here the effect of a contractionary fiscal policy. So a contractionary fiscal policy means a fall in net government spending, and that means that would reduce income. That means consumption will fall. When consumption falls, income will fall again, and will go in the same circle or the same process until we reach equilibrium. Okay. Similar changes might happen in the money market, because lower income means lower demand for money for transaction, and again the adjustment here should happen either through again the interest rate if the central bank does not choose the interest rate, then it will let the adjustment happen through the change in the interest rate. But if they choose the interest rate, then the adjustment has to happen through the money supply. So in our case here, or the graph you see here, basically the adjustment happen in the money market. The adjustment would happen through changing money supply, because we have a horizontal LM curve. So that means this is the level of the interest rate that's given by, or that's chosen by the central bank, and then they are ready to do any adjustment to keep that interest rate at that level. Okay, and that's why you see I bar. So that means it's fixed, is given by the central bank. But what we want to see now, or what we should focus on now, what happened to the IS? So it's a contractionary fiscal policy. The IS curve shift to the left. So it moves. So let's say this is the initial equilibrium point A, and after the contractionary fiscal policy took place, that shift the IS curve to the left, and then we move to A prime, or another equilibrium point, and this is what happened to the output. So the adjustment here means that what happened to Y according, or as a result of the contractionary fiscal policy that we see now, we have a lower output level. Similarly, you could think of another scenario. Is this clear? Do you have any questions? Okay, so what I'm trying to explain in detail today is that the process, how the process happened. We said this last time. We had the scenario when fiscal policy, or there was a contraction in fiscal policy and how that affects equilibrium. But what we're trying to focus on now is just the process, how that works. So another scenario in which monetary policy, again, if we focus on a change in monetary policy, just to remind you again, we think of the ceteris paribus condition, but that means the shift will happen through, or the change or the effect will take, will happen through the changes to the LM curve, because the change happened to monetary condition here. So the monetary policy meaning change in interest rate or change in the money supply. So basically that will affect the LM curve, not the IS curve. So that should be clear. So let's see what will happen in the money market. So basically there's an initial rise. If we have an expansionary monetary policy, that means initial rise in money supply, and that will lower interest rate. Just remember, if the central bank choose the interest rate, then the adjustment should happen through changing that money supply to achieve that interest rate. But how the goods market adjust to this change? So obviously, if we're talking about a rise in the interest rate, a lower interest rate, we know what would happen when we have a lower interest rate. That means the adjustment happen in the goods market through the effect of the interest rate on investment. Okay, so remember how the interest rate is linked to the goods market mainly through its effect on investment. So a lower interest rate, that means a higher investment level, and that means a higher aggregate demand or higher income level. And that higher income means, again, we go the same round, higher consumption leads to higher income, and so on until we reach the equilibrium point. So this is an expansionary monetary policy. Okay, so an expansionary monetary policy, again, on the graph, that means a lower interest rate. So we moved from this level. The equilibrium point was A at the initial point here, so it was A, and then the associated output level was Y, and once there's an expansionary monetary policy or a drop in or a lower interest rate, which is I prime here, that means a shift downward in the LM curve, and that results in a new equilibrium point where we have a higher output level, Y bar. Okay, so what explains this process is here. This is what happened in the money market as a result, and what happened in the goods market as a result. But at the end, the outcome or the final outcome we have is a rise or an increase in the output level. Okay, so this is the effect of an expansionary monetary policy. So that means lower interest rate, shifting the LM curve downward, and then that means higher output level. So the other scenario now, when we use a policy mix. So do we have to use fiscal policy and monetary policy separately or in an independent way? No. So there could be a policy mix where you can actually use both together. So in this scenario here, you see a fiscal expansion would, so that means government spending increased. So that would increase IS curve or shift the IS curve to the right. And if we have a monetary expansion at the same time, so that will drop LM curve down, and that means we move from point A to point A prime, which means even a further increase in output level. So both policies, monetary policy and fiscal policy, worked in the same direction. Both were expansionary policies. Okay, so they pushed the output level up or higher output level, and also the interest rate was lower. Okay, so this is like a policy mix, using both together in the same time. So think about them. This is exactly what we did in two stages or separately. We did first what would happen if there's a fiscal policy change, and then what would happen if there's a monetary policy change. Then the policy mix here means what if these two happens at the same time, how this will affect equilibrium. So what we have here is both policies are expansionary policies, so that means you have more government spending and then lower interest rate. So government spending or the change in fiscal policy result in a shift in the IS curve to the right from IS to IS prime. A lower interest rate or an expansionary monetary policy result in a shift in the LM curve downward, and then the final outcome here was A prime, which means higher level of output from Y to Y prime and lower level for the interest rate. Okay? So this is an example of this policy mix, and that happened in the US in 2001, and there was a recession. And as you can see, what you see here is the GDP growth between 1999 quarter 1 to 2002 quarter 4, and you can see here this is the a growth in real GDP. So you can see here in this, the shaded area here was kind of negative. And how the Fed or the central bank in the US and the US government responded to this change or to this recession, how they wanted to, or how they pulled the economy out of this recession. So they used the policy mix, which exactly we explain now. So what you expected them to do? So they are now going through a recession, bad time really. So you'd imagine that we should have an expansionary policy. Okay, so talking about a mix here, so meaning using both a fiscal and monetary policy, I would imagine they increased government spending, okay, and also at the same time lower their interest rate, and that's exactly what happened. So if you look at this data for the interest rate from 1999 to 2002, so you see the interest rate dropped from 6.5% to 2%. So that's an expansionary monetary policy. Again, they want to deal with that situation, with the recession that happened at this time. So they use the policy mix that would help the economy or stimulate the economy and help the economy or take the economy out of recession. So one side, they had or they applied an expansionary monetary policy, and also on the other side, they also applied an expansionary fiscal policy. You can see now the difference between revenues and spending. So just think of these as G and T, G minus T, and now you see that government spending was much higher than taxes, and that was the change from the previous period. So which means again it was an expansionary fiscal policy. So this is just an example of again a policy mix. There is another example here which related to what we talked about before. If you remember, when we talked about equilibrium in the goods market, we said equilibrium can happen, or the equilibrium condition can be stated as production equal income, or investment equal saving. This is private saving and public saving, so it's T minus G. T minus G, here's the difference between taxes and government spending. So the question here, is it good or bad for investment to reduce deficit? Because this difference here, T minus G, is the difference between taxes and government spending. So difference between revenue and spending. So the idea here, at a given level of private spending, which is S here, so a lower government deficit, so that means higher T minus G, means higher investment. Okay, However, so if you reduce that, that means higher investment. However, that means a fiscal contraction. And we said before how a fiscal contraction, so a contraction in fiscal policy would lower the output level, and if you lower the output level, that means you lower incomes, and when you lower income, that means lower savings. So that means, again, the T minus G increases. The drop in S will be more than the what happened to the T minus G, and that at the end will lead to a decrease in investment level. So how can you get out of this? So now, if you want to reduce the deficit, that means that might actually lead to a drop in investment. Again, the process happened here, or this adjustment happened through what would happen to incomes as a result of a contractionary policy that will drop output level, and that might be even more than the increase that you had in the investment. So one way to do this, we could have policy mix where you have fiscal contraction, so you try to reduce the budget deficit, and at the same time you have monetary expansion, so you actually having policies that actually working opposite direction. So you have fiscal contraction, so you try to control the budget deficit or reduce the budget deficit, and at the same time you follow or you apply a monetary or expansionary monetary policy. In that case, we can expect from the fiscal policy, the contraction fiscal policy, that the IS curve will shift to the left, and an expansionary policy. So if, let's say, this was our initial equilibrium point A, and now as a result of a contractionary fiscal policy, we move from this IS to IS prime. Okay, but at the same time, what happened here is we actually had an expansionary monetary policy, which means that LM curve will drop, will go to this point, which is LM prime. So the final outcome here, which is this point, so that means we reduced the government or the budget deficit, and at the same time, we didn't really suffer from a lower output level. Because remember, if we just follow a contractionary fiscal policy, we would have moved from A to A prime. So that should be where the output level should be if we didn't complement that with an expansionary monetary policy. But because we had an expansionary monetary policy, that means the LM curve shift downward, and that means this is the new equilibrium point where we have nearly exactly the same output level, but with a lower level of budget deficits. Okay, so again, this is just another example of how policy mix can work. So these are also this part now of the lecture, we just focused on how different policy mixes or how different policies, fiscal policy or monetary policy, will affect the interest rate and output level. And the last part, we just talked about the mix, how we can mix both fiscal policy and monetary policy to achieve whatever target you're trying to, or whatever objectives you have. So the last part, or the last few minutes in the lecture, I just want to talk about a special case which we call it's called the liquidity trap. And basically, when that happens, when the interest rate is very low, okay, so it's nearly zero, so it's very close to zero or zero, and in such case, people believe that the next movement for the interest rate is likely to be up, because the interest rate cannot be negative. So what that means, so because interest rate cannot be negative, so that means people will hold money instead of bonds. Why? Because lower interest rate means lower opportunity cost for holding money. Remember, before we said people can split their financial wealth between money and wealth, and we know that money is liquid. Money and bonds. Money is a liquid asset, but bonds offer interest rate. But now, if interest rate is zero, okay, very close to zero or zero, so that means bonds do not offer that again. So that means the opportunity cost of holding money is very low or even zero if the interest rate is zero. So it pays little interest. Bonds pay little interest or no interest at all, and also it's expected the bonds price expected to fall. If you remember, from last time we talked about lecture 4, we talked about the relationship between the bonds price and interest rate, and we said this is the negative relationship between both. So if you expect that interest rate should rise in the near future, so that means lower price or the bonds price expected to fall. As a result of this situation, so people prefer basically prefer liquidity, and that's why it's called liquidity trap. So they prefer holding money. Okay, rather than bonds, and that means demand for money is really high. So what is the problem here? We actually highlighted this issue in the first lecture when we gave an overview of the model. We said this sort of, we call it zero lower bound of the interest rate. The interest rate cannot go below that. So if the economy is going through a recession, then the monetary authorities, they usually would do, they would try to follow an expansionary monetary policy, which means reduce the interest rate. But the interest rate cannot go below zero. So that means the monetary policy will be ineffective, is not going to be working at this situation. Okay, because the idea is to lower the interest rate, and if you cannot lower the interest rate than zero, which is true, so the interest rate cannot be negative. So that means the monetary policy loses its effectiveness, so it cannot affect output level anymore. Again, because the situation in which the interest rate is already very low or zero, and that's why. It's called a trap because people prefer holding liquidity. And we said that before. So what that means to the demand, the demand for money, or the money demand curve. Remember what we said about the demand money curve, the money demand curve. We said it's downward sloping. But if interest rate is zero, so that means this is not true. So it's not downward sloping curve. At this point, you will see kind of horizontal demand for money curve. So let me just show you this quickly, what that means on the graph. So remember, this is the equilibrium in the money market, which is the intersection between the money supply, which is a vertical line. Remember, we have here money or the stock or money stock on the horizontal axis and interest rate on the vertical axis. So we said because the money supply is decided by the central bank, we plot that as a vertical line, if you remember. And then demand for money is downward sloping curve because again, there are three reasons to demand money. We said transaction, and that's related to income. It's positively related to income, but the other two, speculative demand and precautionary demand, both are related to interest rate and negatively related to interest rate, and that's why you have a downward sloping curve for demand for money. But then, this is in normal time. But if you have a very low interest rate or nearly zero interest rate, that segment of the demand for money curve become horizontal, like as you see here. And the problem here is when the central bank try to change monetary policy or try to follow, let's say, an expansionary monetary policy where they want to increase money supply. So they want, let's say there is a recession and they want to boost the economy. So the way to do that with a monetary policy is just to follow an expansionary policy where you increase money supply. Okay, so increasing money supply interest rate should be lower, and that will boost investment, and that will you'll see the effect through also in the goods market through change in investment, and that will ultimately affect output level. But this mechanism is not in place now, it's not working now. Why? Because when you change money supply from this this one, ms prime to ms prime to prime, this one, double prime. So that means we move from this point, the equilibrium point, move from B to C, and nothing happened to the interest rate because the interest rate cannot go negative. Okay? So that means basically what we're trying to say here, that means monetary policy become ineffective, cannot work, and cannot affect output level in that case. Because the way the monetary policy affects output level is through the changes in money supply, which change interest rate, and that affect the investment, and the investment affect aggregate demand, and that ultimately will affect or will change output level. But if that interest rate mechanism is not working, it's not there, okay, you can't change that interest rate anymore because it's very low, it's zero, okay? That's why monetary policy become ineffective. Anyway, so that's everything I wanted to discuss today. Next time we'll conclude the IS model, and then we move to the next topic. Thank you so much.